think about these small organizations who are working on behalf of our local farmers. Instead of utilizing that funding to open new markets, they were having to focus on this, once again, what I would say is a politicized process, a politicized study. And it hurt them. Organizations are still hurting because of the amount of resources they had to provide for this process. And I think that is an untold story that needs to be shared because we see even more studies being proposed.
Welcome back to DAM, the official podcast of Northwest Hydropower. I'm your host, Austin Rohr, and I manage all things communications here at Northwest River Partners. For those of you who've never paid the Who We Are page of our website a visit, educating the public and policymakers and engaging in public processes associated with hydropower is core to our work. So it makes perfect sense here at DAM that we dedicate some more time to the subject. And, as I so often remind you, I am not the subject matter expert. I'm just the guy who seeks out subject matter experts to lob questions at in an attempt to provide you with some relevant and interesting information. We could debate whether or not I've been successful in that attempt thus far, but what's not up for debate is the credentials of today's guest, Sean O'Brien, who I'm very excited to have on today. Sean, thanks for carving out some time to join us.
Austin, it's so great to be with you. Northwest River Partners was an invaluable partner, may I say, as I was a congressional staffer in Washington, D.C. for a great amount of time working on these issues. And so it's so great to continue the relationship and to be with you today.
Absolutely. And today you come to us from the Washington Policy Center, where you're currently the Eastern Washington Director. But you do have an extensive background you touched on there a bit in terms of policy in really both Washingtons. So take me through your career a little bit and the experiences you compiled this far.
That's right. From one Washington to the other and back again, really. So as a Pacific Northwesterner, grew up outside of Portland, went to school at Gonzaga for college, lived in Seattle for a few years before I did venture off to the other Washington for a stint on Capitol Hill. You know, it's been an amazing opportunity for me to really be able to work on behalf of the Pacific Northwest and Washington State in both localities, both here in Washington State where I'm now located. I'm a Tri-Citian, living in Tri-Cities for the past 6 months now after moving back from Washington, D.C. But yeah, previously was in D.C. for 8 years, working for Congressman Newhouse from when he was first elected as a freshman, and stayed with him all of those 8 years, and incredibly proud of the work that I was able to do alongside the congressman, specifically on these issues of critical importance of infrastructure and natural resources in our region.
And so during that time, you know, what exactly sort of different things did you work in? I mean, you know, what is it like to be in that role over there?
Yeah, you bet. So I was the congressman's lead staffer on all things energy, environment, natural resources. So specifically looking at, you know, obviously the Columbia Snake River power system, the Columbia River Treaty, which is obviously just a huge issue for our region. Certainly salmon and predation issues. And then also on the energy side of things, from our nuclear and hydro roots, as well as to our ventures into new clean energy, additional clean energy on top of those baseload resources. Obviously, we've got a lot of exciting things taking place on the new nuclear front. So the congressman, being an appropriator, serving on the appropriations committee, played a really pivotal role, specifically on the energy and water subcommittee of the appropriations committee that funds a lot of these resources, these resource-based systems. And so he really was in a key leadership role to make sure that, you know, our river power system was operated and funded appropriately. And so it was a critical role, and he continues to serve on that subcommittee in Washington, D.C. And so I was proud to serve as the lead there. And I'd be remiss if I didn't go back to your point that I'm now with Washington Policy Center. We're a state-based public policy think tank focusing a lot on Olympia's operations. And so it's been really full circle for me to be able to go from the federal level and now back to the state level in returning home. I actually interned at the Policy Center nearly a dozen years ago, just out after my time at Gonzaga, and so it's been fun to return home now and really utilize a lot of the skills and knowledge that I gained in DC and now attribute it back to the state level. And obviously there's a lot of interaction and dynamics that take place between the state and federal components. And frankly, I think a lot more could be shared, both the good ideas and the bad, when it comes to learning from our experiences between the state and feds. And I think that's a key role that I'm really wanting to lean in on in my role as Eastern Washington director with the Policy Center, in helping build that bridge of communication and sharing ideas between our state leaders and those who are elected at the federal level.
Well, it speaks too to there's kind of this thing that we brought up, I touched on and you mentioned as well, of there kind of being two Washingtons, right? And it seems like the thing that I often hear is that in DC and really for a lot of the country, you don't even really think of Washington in terms of the state, right? I mean, it's just something that people who aren't from our area maybe aren't really focused on. And in some ways, it seems like that also applies to some of the issues we have here. So I could imagine that in some ways, having the experience of being at that federal level and trying to bridge that gap, there's a value there in making sure that, hey, let's make sure Northwest issues are on the radar.
Well, that's exactly right. And, it's funny, so many folks in DC refer to it as Washington, whereas myself coming from Washington State, I refer to it as DC. But you're absolutely right. I should point out that Congressman Newhouse serves as chairman of the Congressional Western Caucus, and for my last 2 years in DC, I served as the executive director of the caucus. And it's a coalition of members of Congress. At the time, we had roughly 80 members of Congress who not only come from the West, but really who represent rural communities, rural districts across the country. And the key reason that entity even exists was to provide that voice for communities who often aren't listened to or often aren't heard of or thought of when it comes to how policy is decided in DC. And so together, bringing those voices of those rural leaders, they provide themselves a stronger platform to make sure that their communities are listened to, are heard of. And I think, my returning home to Eastern Washington is very much a similar kind of dynamic where, far often in Olympia, the decisions that are being made focus a lot on, Seattle and King County, really the population bases. And so my role here is to make sure that the rural communities of Eastern Washington are heard in Olympia, and that our concerns, our ideas are included in that mix as well. And so again, it's been that fun dynamic of doing so at the federal level, making sure that the rural pockets, the small communities across the country are heard, and now doing so at the state level here on the east side of the Cascade Curtain.
It's an interesting dynamic that you mentioned there too as well, because so often in our work here at the organization, we're trying to look at hydropower issues, energy resources, environmental issues, all these things as, issues that don't necessarily need to be partisan, right? They really should be viewed as a bipartisan effort to try and make sure that we're all moving in the same direction. But at least for us here in the Northwest, there is sort of another partisanship which exists, which is that divide between the East and the West side. And the challenges of the rural communities on the east side don't necessarily align with some of the policies that are dreamed up on the west side, and so I think it'd be interesting, as we go through today's conversation, to kind of further examine the ways in which we can all kind of, bridge some of those gaps and sort of try to extinguish at least some of that divide.
Well, and that's so true. And it's funny because the vast majority of action that takes place both in Washington, D.C. and in Olympia is overwhelmingly bipartisan and frankly nonpartisan. And so often we end up getting put into these boxes of your side versus my side, whether it's geographically or on partisan lines. And yet every year, our delegation in the Pacific Northwest come together and all support the same budget that funds our system, that funds our energy resources, that funds our natural resource management. And so it's kind of a head scratcher that actually, if we were just to take a step back and remove ourselves from those partisan leanings that we often get boxed into, these things are all supported on, frankly, a unanimous basis constantly. And so I think that's something really important that we need to recognize and perhaps find ways to tap into more to bring out the brighter angels of these dynamics rather than the just severe and divisive partisanship.
Absolutely. And, hydropower isn't the only issue that I follow. Obviously, it's something I pay attention to here for work. But outside of work, there's lots of other things that I'm keeping my eye on as well. And what you said, I think, is certainly true of, really a lot of issues when it comes to policy and government and things like that, which is, the stuff that actually gets done tends to be really partisan and unanimous. And the things that don't get done are maybe the ones that are more divisive and make the headlines, but they don't necessarily translate into actual action. So it's an interesting thing to observe.
Yeah, and I'll just say to your point about the fact that certainly that's the case on all a myriad of issues across the gamut. But I would say even on the hydropower piece, I mean, you think about that energy and water budget, that subcommittee funding appropriations bill that I mentioned Mr. Newhouse serves on. Again, every year we end up coming to a bipartisan consensus to fund that. And that's everyone supporting, rehab on our dams and habitat restoration budgets and all these things. So I think again, even on hydro, even on some of these, what we see as contentious issues, that our delegation always ends up actually on the same side to support these budgets. And so I think again that focusing on that common ground, that idea that, hey, we actually do all end up coming together at the end of the day is something that I think could really benefit a lot of these other discussions that are taking place, some of these other challenging discussions that are taking place.
Well, I appreciate that you speak from a place of experience on that as well. And speaking of experience, looking through some of your biography and background for today's discussion, I also see that there's some mention of different programs you've been a part of as well, outside of just actual career and sort of the stuff that you might see on a resume. One of these is this AgForestry leadership program. Could you explain what that is and what you've gained from being a part of it?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you flagging that. It truly was such a worthwhile opportunity. And I love to give Mr. Newhouse a hard time because Mr. Newhouse was in class 4 of the program, and I just graduated from class 43. So I'd love to poke him a little bit there. But so AgForestry, as mentioned, it's been around for decades now, and it's a leadership development program for mid-career professionals who work in resources, forestry, agriculture, or any adjacent industry or sector that surrounds those issues. And I was a bit of the odd man out being the policy guy, but obviously handling those issues, it was directly pertinent. And I was also the odd man out because a majority of the 2-year program, I was actually based in Washington, D.C., and I would travel home for our seminars. So the program is really structured over a dozen seminars held in every corner of the state where we go and we talk to local leaders. We go on field tours and learn about industries and sectors on the ground. And it's through that direct collaboration, conversations, dialogue, that we come together, and this is not a partisan group. In fact, we were made up of bipartisan perspectives within it, and together we not only focus on our inner leadership uh, skills development and things like that, but also how we can serve as leaders in the community, working on these, very challenging dynamics and conversations, from forestry to our waterways to agriculture, et cetera. So, and then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that there's also 2 seminars, both in Washington, D.C. and then internationally. And so our class actually traveled to Vietnam at the beginning of this year. And it was an incredible opportunity for us to learn a lot more about Washington State's exports and how we develop new markets overseas. Obviously, our access to the Pacific Rim is second to none, and so the opportunity to see that firsthand and how those markets are developed was incredibly worthwhile. So it was an awesome program to be a part of. And it was neat for me, again, as the policy guy, to be able to get home to Washington State and to all corners of the state and learn a lot more, but also see some of the on the ground action that's taking place with the very policy that I was handling in Washington, D.C.
And you mentioned you were the odd man out in a sense. So maybe you could paint a better picture. Who was the sort of common person there? I mean, what other types of people made up your class?
Yeah, so I would say nearly 50% were actual producers, right? So we've got a wheat farmer from Dayton, a dairy woman from Sunnyside, blueberry farmer from up in the Skagit Valley. And then you've got other folks who work in the forestry sector. So we obviously have some incredibly prominent names like Weyerhaeuser in our neck of the woods, Sierra Pacific. And so we had employees of those companies as well. And some also just, business adjacent folks who certainly work directly with some of those industries. But yes, I was the odd man out as the policy guy. And so it was a great opportunity for us to share our different perspectives and professional experiences and backgrounds to learn a ton. And we were the first post-COVID class, so we were actually a smaller group, which I think lent to even more opportunity to get to know each other really well. And I think that particularly became evident in our international travels to Vietnam for 2 weeks, where we had just a phenomenal time. We ran day and night to just see as much as we could, learn as much as we could, and it was incredibly valuable.
It's kind of cliche to say, but networking is everything in a sense, right? And that sounds like an incredible networking opportunity. And given what your current role is and also what you've done in the past, I'm sure that there was a lot of learning that you could gain from being in that kind of group and being surrounded by those sorts of folks. And with all that experience in mind, could you share maybe some of the stories from working so closely on these issues and being surrounded by these different groups of people?
Yeah, maybe I'll point back to my time with the Congressional Western Caucus, where as mentioned, it was our job to really highlight the voices of communities, small rural communities across the country. And it was incredibly invaluable because, we would travel a ton with Mr. Newhouse to visit his members' districts. And, we're not going to the big cities, right? We're going to the small little pockets that you wouldn't necessarily have a reason to travel to or through without this direct purpose. And so whether it was ice fishing in northern Minnesota in February in negative 25-degree weather, where we could learn about their specific resource challenges and also their resource strengths from the neck of the woods there, or down to New Mexico. Or Southern California, and it's kind of looking at some of the same wildfire challenges that the Pacific Northwest faces. Certainly our friends in California do as well. And so it was my job to find opportunities to provide the most benefit for both members of Congress who are on these field tours, as well as their staff, to be able to see and learn and hear as much information as possible when going to these communities, and making sure that the local communities felt like they were having their voices heard as well. So it was these incredibly creative opportunities for us to jump into a community for 2 days, let's say, pack it full of talking to as many people as possible, seeing as many things as possible. And I think that's provided me also just an opportunity to benefit the Pacific Northwest and our region as well, because we also hosted field tours here where we brought members of Congress out here to our river power system and got them on the river and through a lock-in dam, and to learn about some of the incredible research taking place at our dams, led by Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, on how we can continue to maximize the benefits for our fish species while coexisting with our river power system. And, we've got world-class research and world-class infrastructure here because of that hard work of fish biologists and scientists in the region. And I think that's something that we should be really proud of, and we need to continue to tell that story. And it was through opportunities like these field tours with the Congressional Western Caucus that we were able to introduce those stories to members of Congress from Arkansas and Iowa and other regions of the country who may not have any idea about the enormous benefits that we receive in the Pacific Northwest because of our river power system.
Oh, and I probably sound like a broken record on this podcast by this point, but I'll just emphasize once again that, I can speak personally to just how powerful being in the field is, and how much of a difference it makes seeing things firsthand. And I want to touch on that certainly more. But one other thing too is my experience here has been, and my experience really throughout, my own personal career has been that getting to go out and engage with these different communities and bring these people together and give them an opportunity to share their experience. You really see just how willing and excited that people are to share that, and to have someone to listen. I think a lot of times people are looking for that ear to kind of listen in to what they have to share, and whether it's things they're excited about, concerned about, maybe issues that they have that they want a solution to. I mean, you see kind of the whole gamut there. And so I'm curious if you have any specific examples that might come to mind of some of those experiences of getting to travel all these different places and engage with communities.
Well, I'll just say, perhaps not necessarily as a specific example, but just the overall experience. Never once, whether it was talking to a farmer in West Texas, or a mining worker in northern Minnesota when we went through that region, not once did any of those people who had this opportunity to share their perspectives and their way of life with a new audience, with members of Congress from across the country, never once did they go up and first say, "Are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? Or where do you stand on this issue? Or where do you stand on that issue?" Rather, it's, "Thank you so much for coming to listen. Let me tell you about our way of life. Let me tell you about our industry." And I think, again, that just kind of goes to show, if we're able to not fall into the so often, forced dynamic that we're put into, whether it's because of the media or just our system in general, where we can shed those boxes, shed those partisan leanings, and just realize that we're all just people, we're all just communities together. wanting to work hard to benefit our families and our local communities, it makes things a heck of a lot easier to have a dialogue. And again, I think it benefits the ability to have some of the tougher discussions when we are talking about our challenges, to be able to actually come to maybe some common ground there. So, like you said, it was just an invaluable opportunity to see so many of these different corners of the country that I didn't have the chance to have ever done. And I'm incredibly grateful for that opportunity. And it was really hard work. I think it's no secret Capitol Hill runs 24/7, and this dynamic and this unique role with the Western Caucus, where we were not working for one member of Congress, we were working on behalf of 80. It surely lent to we could always be finding more work to be doing to benefit these communities that those members of Congress represent, and I absolutely loved the work.
I would say your message definitely gives me hope in the sense that I think if you can find the common ground somewhere between someone from Texas and someone from Minnesota, hopefully we can find some common ground here in the Northwest on our own issues in our backyard. So one thing I do really want to ask is, you mentioned these field hearings and tours and things like that. How have those moved the needle for you personally, as far as what you've been able to observe firsthand?
I think it really does lend to a willingness when people, and you mentioned this, just the importance of putting boots on the ground, a willingness to hear other perspectives. It can be so easy in a hearing room in Washington, D.C. to kind of exactly paint those lines of you're over there, I'm over here. We're going to kind of just dig in. And when you're on the ground, just interacting with people, it just kind of sheds that barrier that I think that hardened exterior that we all like to bear at times. And so often our leaders are the ones who are talking and not necessarily listening. And so when that script is flipped and they're actually on the ground being the ones to listen, I think that is just super valuable. And the same is to be said for just the staffers as well, who get to learn so much from these opportunities as well.
It's funny as you were saying that, because the thing that came to mind was, gosh, that sounds a lot like the issues that we have today on a broad scale as it relates to social media. There's kind of a similar barrier, it sounds like, in terms of, what people are willing to say and where they're willing to dig their heels in when we're having discussions online. And then you actually go out, you talk to people face to face, and, you get out into these communities, and all that kind of erases pretty quickly.
Well, it's funny you bring that up. You and I had not talked about this, or I don't think I necessarily provided this background in my bio information to you, but I'm actually right now in a national fellowship with the American Enterprise Institute back in Washington, D.C., looking specifically at what we're calling civic renewal and that idea of civility. And uniquely, I just participated in a roundtable discussion with Lieutenant Governor Denny Heck, who is working on something called the Civic Health Project, where he's looking specifically at, in Washington communities, how we can bring civility back into our dialogue. And so it's been a fun project for me on the side to be looking at ways that we can rebuild civility in our institutions. And I think that's the key piece, is that focus on institutions in our communities that have been degraded. But I got to tell you, that conversation with Lieutenant Governor and other leaders, the conversation was taking place in Spokane. The number one piece was the role of social media and technology. And I talked about the fact that, every Sunday I get that little notification on my phone of how many hours spent on the phone this past week. And, my average is usually around 9 hours a day. And that's just on that screen. That's not including my laptop. And I think there is no doubt about it that the role of social media has only further divided and put us in our separate various camps, and et cetera. And it frankly, it just, at the end of the day, dehumanizes things. And I don't want to go too far down the tangent here, but I think just going back to that ability to have a dialogue with others who may not necessarily see eye to eye. Social media has only harmed that piece, and I think we even fall into that when we look at some of our challenges on our resources here in the Northwest and our river system. It's a hell of a lot easier to throw out a divisive tweet than it is to sit down and say, let's have a multi-hour conversation about the actual facts on the ground and how we can move forward together.
Definitely. And I think that's the amazing thing about getting people in person is it just, it immediately removes that. I mean, I'm all for finding solutions to do that in other ways, but yeah, I don't think there's anything that quite as quickly, pulls away all those sort of challenges as fast as getting people actually in the same place and having them all kind of, observing the same thing. And I know I asked you how some of these things have moved the needle for you, but what has your experience been as far as seeing how this might change, how these sort of field tours and things change perspectives for the people that you're taking out? I mean, I know personally for me, I can attest to the fact that, when you get some of these folks out there and they see things, it's really a perspective shifter. But I'd like to hear, what your own experience has been with that.
Well, I know that we do so at the state level as well, right? I know that every year, some of our industry-based folks, like our friends at the potato, the potato commission, to the grain commission, and others, invite legislators from Olympia to come over and learn about agriculture in the state, learn about our river system, learn about the energy challenges here, and I think that's certainly the most beneficial, with the Western Caucus, here's a coalition of members who largely do see eye to eye on a majority of issues, and they still have the chance to learn a ton. But when you can actually bring folks who are quite divided, who see things from very different perspectives, and when you can bring them together to maybe push some of the preconceived notions that they have about certain policies or industries, that's really where I think the needle can be moved. And to your point, it comes back to that ability to spend time in person with one another is invaluable. And a lot of people say that that's one of the reasons that DC has changed so much from the quote good old days, is when members would largely spend a majority of their time and their lives in DC when they were elected. Their families would be based there because it was a lot more difficult to be able to get home and to travel to their districts. And so they would spend more time together. They would have more meals together. Their families would get to know one another. But nowadays, they're constantly on the road, flying back home, having to fundraise, et cetera. And so it lends to less relationship building, less dialogue. And I think I think field hearings and those kind of opportunities, field tours, those kind of opportunities certainly provide positive benefits at the micro level, but I think there perhaps should be some kind of macro conversations and challenging ourselves to look at how can we make sure that we're not going so far down the needle where we don't interact with one another at all. And COVID had a huge impact on that. I mean, elected officials weren't gathering together for months on end. There were some members who didn't go to DC, for over a year. And I think that really corrodes the ability to build relationships, especially those across the aisle that are so important. So, again, I think I'm going down the rabbit hole a little bit here, but I think just providing those venues to have dialogue with folks who you may not see eye to eye with are certainly the key to being able to find common ground in our challenging debates that we have in the country.
Well, and I'll just say I appreciate that you do go down that rabbit hole because it's an interesting thing to sit there and think about a bit. I mean, I know as we were discussing today, for example, one of the things that came up is like, gosh, I don't know that we've ever met. You're right. I mean, with COVID and everything, obviously we've been, working together, River Partners and Policy Center and everything like that, and partnering with, some of the efforts congressionally and all that. But there's that question of like, yeah, I don't think we've ever been in the same place at the same time. you know and that's certainly a thing that I think a lot of people can relate to, but we might not realize that it also is impacting our politics, and that just the same way that average people in our everyday lives are not as connected as we were before. The people that are trying to run the country and make policy decisions aren't really building relationships a normal way either. And so it's really interesting to think about it from that perspective.
Well, and let's just say that you were on one partisan side and I was on another partisan side. Just think, here you and I have a working relationship and have never met, but if we were on opposite sides of the aisle or of an issue or what have you, you got to think just how much more detrimental that fact is of not being able to build that relationship or have a dialogue at all. And obviously, again, just so greatly appreciate the working relationship that we have had with Northwest River Partners over the years. But so it kind of just it lends a little bit of understanding of, wow, no wonder things can be challenging. Is if folks aren't even talking or have never had the opportunity to engage with one another, how can we expect for progress to be made?
No, that is a really good point. And it definitely is. It's something that I appreciate you're able to share, because people just wouldn't probably ever think about it. I mean, it's kind of obvious in some ways when you really sit down and start going through the motions on that. But I don't know that would just be immediately obvious to the average person. Going back to kind of that discussion though, how does all this experience put you now in the position that you're at, where you are tied into the hydropower issues, to the river system, the communities, everything like that. You touched on it a little bit with your previous work, but obviously now it's become more of something that's kind of a big part of what you're working on.
Yeah, I think, that creativity piece is something that I so very much enjoy, but also think is really important in that in telling our story. And I a huge takeaway from my experience with AgForestry, where you had, all of us gathering from various sectors and industries. And a key takeaway for all of us is we all need to better tell our story. It helps educate others. It helps enlighten folks, again, to kind of lose those preconceived notions they may have. And so for me, tapping into that creativity of being able to tell stories about the leadership that is espoused by industry and again our incredible leadership here in the region on energy issues and resource management is something that I am really excited to be tapping into now, to collaborate between both the federal and the state and local storytelling. And so from your traditional means of telling a story to perhaps the more unique and creative components of, like, getting a group of members of Congress on a boat here at Columbia Point in Richland and shipping them up the river and through a lock and dam. I think it's really exciting for me to be able to now tap into finding new ways that we can collaborate to tell our story. And again, I think that sense of pride that we have in our region. I mean, we feed the world here in Eastern Washington, and we power not only the state, but the region and other states as well. And we do it cleanly and we do it affordably. And so I think that's something that is one reason I was so excited to be able to return home and to become a Washington state citizen again, although I certainly have always claimed that during my time in DC. And so I think the opportunity now again to be boots on the ground here and helping contribute to the ability for local communities to tell their story is just so fulfilling for me, and I'm excited about the opportunities to come, including some coming up here in the very near future that I know you'd love to chat about.
Absolutely. One of those stories in particular is something that we discussed when we were kind of setting up, getting ready for the podcast, and you brought up a fascinating untold story that really caught my attention. And untold stories are kind of a big part of what we've tried to make Damn the podcast all about. So maybe firstly, I'll just set the scene for folks real quickly. Last year, we saw the completion of the Murray-Inslee process, which engaged in regional stakeholders and the public to try to figure out whether or not the lower Snake River dams could be removed. And naturally, at Northwest River Partners, we're lower Snake River Dam advocates, and we were a bit critical of that process and felt that it asked kind of the wrong question, because it really looked at whether the dams could be removed instead of whether they should be removed. And ultimately, we did see that outcome as a success. It clearly stated that dam removal is infeasible in the near term and that other efforts to recover salmon should be prioritized. But on the other hand, from what you described to me, it sounds like, okay, on paper that's great, but it isn't all all positives. Maybe you could describe to me from your perspective what that Murray-Inslee process looked like, first of all.
Yeah, well, I think it's so important to recognize that when government takes action, it places an impact on people, on communities, on industries. And so this idea of, all right, we're going to study this again, that may sound all fine and good, but when you actually dig into what does that mean when an official government process is initiated to study an issue, that means any of the people, employees, sectors, organizations, communities impacted by that issue have to devote time, energy, resources, money, their budgets in order to make sure that they aren't left out of that analysis. And so here we are, last year is when it concluded, but the study was initiated right on the tail end of COVID, in which, let's talk about our agricultural community for a moment. We had markets absolutely decimated, destroyed, disappeared because of the unique challenges that COVID brought about. And so you think of some of our, state-supported organizations like our agricultural commissions. So think of like the Grain Commission. They have very limited budgets, and those budgets, they would like to be utilized to open new markets so that we can find opportunities for our growers and producers to send their products to other regions, to other to new markets. And rather than that small funding being utilized to do so, it instead had to be focused on playing defense, on making sure that all of their data, all of their information is coordinated and provided for this governmental process to make sure that they aren't left behind. Because if they don't participate in the process, if they don't lend the facts, the data, the numbers that are so important to be shared with these processes, then the governmental process, the policy makers may make assumptions or may make the wrong decision. And so again, you think about these small organizations who are working on behalf of our local farmers. Instead of utilizing that funding to open new markets, they were having to focus on this, once again, what I would say is a politicized process, a politicized study. And it hurt them. It hurt these organizations. And that's what I've been hearing in my 6 months coming back home is, again, it is this untold story of, we all kind of shrugged off the Murray-Inslee process like, oh, we're so glad that they concluded what they did. All right, let's move forward. But organizations are still hurting because of the amount of resources they had to provide for this process. And I think that is an untold story that needs to be shared, because we see even more studies being proposed again and again and again. And we can continue to study the heck out of these things in hopes of a different conclusion. But when the conclusion continues to be the same thing over and over, you would think the message would would land. That's why, like I said, I do think it's important we talk about these things, even though it may be in the rearview mirror, because it's going to continue to rear its ugly head. And I think it's really unfortunate that that process was one that was political in nature. It harmed local communities, and it didn't do anything to benefit the region or the producers that were so devastated coming out of COVID.
We can certainly relate here at our organization in terms of just the sheer amount of work that we put into it. And, I wouldn't say that we came out of it on the other side, maybe, in the same position as some of the folks you were describing. But yeah, it was definitely, I mean, in terms of just, yeah, stress level, workload, everything like that, it really did, challenge us here. And so, that really does resonate. It's also something that I think is important to bring up, and something that I think I'm hearing you kind of saying as well, is that the nature of the process was interesting in that it wasn't necessarily doing any sort of like new studying. I mean, it wasn't looking for new data, new scientific information, points like that, but really it did rely so heavily on the stakeholders themselves to provide the input. And so I can definitely understand that would create a lot of pressure on some of the folks that you're talking about in terms of making sure that they're being represented there and that they're able to share their side of the story.
Well, and unfortunately, far too much of that data may just be put in the back of the report and not actually utilized in the findings when things are handpicked, and you look at the footnotes at the bottom of the references, and it's just the same sources over and over utilized rather than sharing these other perspectives. But yeah, you talk about your guys' experience. You guys are a small organization, and when you have government step in and dictate these decision making processes, it's all of a sudden like, well, okay, we have to respond. We have to be a part of this process, or we are going to be on the losing end of this. So it's indicative of why I think it was just harmful in nature. I'll go back to that Vietnam trip that I mentioned, that field tour that our AgForestry cohort took. When I couldn't get over this fact, everywhere we traveled, we would, have dinner each night, and they would have, a few selections of beer, similar to our Miller Lite and Coors Light, your household kind of names. And one of the cans, I couldn't get over this. Again, this is the equivalent of their Coors Light that we saw everywhere throughout Vietnam. On the bottom of the can, right on the front, said Yakima hops on it. And I couldn't get over that fact that here we are on the other side of the planet, and in our hands is a product from right here at home. And I think that just goes to show how important we recognize the work of these commissions that, again, are so supported on a nonpartisan basis by our leaders. In opening new markets and providing those opportunities for our growers to feed the world. And again, you think about the impacts of a small little organization having to instead focus on opening those new markets and rather play defense with their own government. It's harmful, but boy, I got to tell you just how much pride I had in the fact that here we are traveling all over Vietnam, and every night in our hand was a can of Yakima Valley hops. That was pretty awesome.
Well, it's really amazing just how important the agriculture of the Northwest is to not only ourselves and our region, but really to the world. And, it's something we try and talk about a lot, but I think sometimes it's still just like, hard for people to wrap their heads around But certainly, if you were to have the kind of experience that you're talking about, I would imagine that would definitely drive the message home maybe a little bit more.
Well, and the diversity of products that we have in the state, right? We have over 300 commodities that we grow here. So, yeah, I mean, no wonder we're going to see these things all over the globe. But to be able to actually see it firsthand, and this was by no means a coordinated stunt or anything like that. This is something that just happened organically that we kept running into, and to have some of my classmates who are coming from these same communities, and some of the others who are like, hey, all right, how can we get our blueberries to this area, or how can we get our wheat utilized here as well? I think it's not only heartening to see it, but also motivational for others, and just demonstrates the impact that a small change can have for a family farmer or a local grower, when it comes to opening up the world's markets for us. And so, we're the most trade reliant state in the country, and I think that's something that we should be proud of. And obviously, our river system plays a huge role in our ability to be exactly that.
It is pretty amazing, and like you said, yeah, I mean, a significant amount of that is making its way out to the rest of the world via our rivers and our locks, which is pretty amazing. And a lot of people, I think, it's easy to take that for granted or say, oh, we could do it another way. But yeah, there's no doubt that those play a huge role in making that whole process happen. One question that I do want to ask you, and I don't mean in terms of numbers, I'll preface it by saying that, but maybe just in terms of, describing the experience for some of these commissions and the groups that you're talking about. I mean, what did the investment look like? I mean, in terms of workload, in terms of, just what sort of things had to be moved and shifted, and what they had to do to make themselves heard in the process. I mean, what did it take to really make this happen? And maybe that'll help paint the picture for people trying to understand, just where they find themselves in the position they're in today.
Oh, we're talking with the Murray-Inslee process, hundreds of thousands of dollars when you look at across the board between the many groups that had to respond to this, and the manpower, and like I said, the time, energy, the funding, the proportion of their budgets put toward this. It's staggering. And I'll just say anecdotally, somebody who was directly involved in responding to this at one point, just behind the scenes in a respectful way, asked Senator Murray's staff and said, did you guys at all consider what kind of impact this has on us, coming out of COVID? And to their credit, they said, wow, no, we didn't really think of that, and I think that can be part of the issue when it comes to government action and to these studies is, oh, this is it, there's no harm, no foul, right? We're just studying these processes and coming out with a report, and we'll see how it goes. But they don't take into consideration just what an impact it does have on organizations, on industries, on local communities. So it is not insignificant by any means, and I think that goes to show why I just feel it's so important that we are telling this story.
I certainly appreciate it too, because I mean, I'm speaking as someone who is here at our organization and saw what we put into it, and yet in some ways you almost become kind of, I don't want to say numb to it, but it's just like, oh yeah, this is what we have to do, right? I mean, this is just part of the work. This is the natural thing that makes sense for us to do in order to be the organization we say we are and everything like that. But to actually really discuss this at length and really start to think about, okay, what is the actual impact here? I mean, I think that's something that is really important to share with the world, because there's a lot of people out there that are going to gain that perspective from listening to today's discussion, and that's a tremendously valuable thing to consider for all of us. Oh,
Just
go
Austin,
ahead.
I'll say that's exactly right. I think, you and I as kind of on the policy side of things, whether it's, with a nonprofit or a congressional office, that's kind of par for the course. This is naturally the kind of work we do. But for a wheat farmer on the Palouse who maybe serves on a board of their commission, to have to again divert so much of their time, energy, and their funding toward these processes, that's not par for the course. That's not part of their job. That's not going to benefit them in feeding the state, the country, the world. And so I think you're exactly right when you say it kind of hopefully can lend some perspective for folks who aren't like you and I who are in an office, but actually the folks who are doing the real hard work out there, right? It just demonstrates again just that depth of impact.
And so, there's something else too that I think is worth mentioning, and it's something that just really came to mind for me today, the morning that we're recording this, which is, a bit before it's actually going to come out and people will be listening to it. But I saw an article that said that Washington State has now become the, I believe, the second highest average gas price in the nation, just behind California. And so when you think about that, looking at sort of the whole timeline of things, you have the pandemic, and then going into this process, and then I imagine for a lot of these rural communities and folks in agriculture that fuel prices, especially like diesel prices, are an extremely big part of their budget and their ability to make sure that they can make everything work, right? I mean, all that equipment takes fuel to power. And so I guess the question I'd like to ask you is, how do these impacts get passed on to the regular folks? I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, well, these guys are, they find themselves in a difficult position now because they stretched themselves so thin to get through the pandemic, or to, allocate resources to participate in the Murray-Inslee process, or, now to try and find ways to make things work with prices and inflation and all these different things increasing. But, when you're talking about crops that go out to the world, I mean, what does that impact actually look like for people?
Well, your timing is funny with that question because actually, again, as of this morning, I actually have a piece in the Spokesman Review today focusing on gas prices and and why they're so high, why they've been so high this year, and frankly, my piece gives the heads up that we should only expect them to increase even more this summer. And again, here I am, now focused on state-based policy, and it's literally just within our state borders that we're seeing this impact. So if you cross over to Idaho, if you cross over to Oregon, you will see that they are not facing the same steep increases we have, and that's because of our new cap and trade climate program, in which industries are having to buy carbon allowances, and at the tune of the first auction raised nearly $300 million that industries had to pay for these allowances back in February, and another was just held at the end of the May to the tune at the end of May, excuse me, to the tune of 557 million that they had to pay this time around, increasing the cost of carbon so high that it actually triggered another auction is going to have to be held in August due to that spike. So state policies have very much a direct impact on your local farmer. And interestingly, and again, I'm going to be going in a little into the weeds here, when that climate bill was signed into law in 2021 by Governor Inslee, it specifically exempted the agricultural industry because they knew what an impact it would have on them. Unfortunately, the Department of Ecology has not done their job in standing up a process for how those exemptions would work. And so agriculture is paying the same increases that everyone else is. And like you said, on diesel specifically, it's even higher. And so, unfortunately, the legislature, a few last minute proposals were thrown out there to try and address this, to try and keep that agricultural exemption in place and actually implemented. But unfortunately, they did not get the job done. And from everything I'm hearing on the ground is this will likely lend to litigation, which is something, unfortunately, you and I are all too familiar with on the river system. Well, the same will be said now for our agricultural producers who are being really just hammered by this cap and trade system and the high gas prices that we're all seeing. So to your point, there is a direct impact, and the governor's office will constantly just kind of point fingers at greedy oil companies, but it's a fundamental recognition, or it should be a fundamental recognition of how markets work, is that when these industries are forced to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in order to purchase these quote allowances, of course those costs are going to have to trickle down to the actual buyers, because that's how a business works. That's how our markets work. That's how capitalism works. And we can blame the greed all we want, but at the end of the day, who is forcing them to pay that more than $500 million in this last auction? And it's the state. It's the state process. And may I just say, we are absolutely the highest in the nation now. California does have a similar process set in place, but after that second auction we just had, we are now paying more than 80% higher on carbon than the state of California, 84% higher than what they've priced their carbon allowances at. So we are unfortunately leading the way in this sense, but I don't think it's for the benefit. And, what we at the Washington Policy Center and my colleague, Todd Myers, who's our director on the Center of Environment, is constantly talking about is, all right, we're paying more for this, but we're actually not going to see a reduction in emissions here. We're paying more for a lack of solutions. Why don't we actually talk about opportunities for solutions to reduce emissions that will actually see an impact, rather than simply taxing our way through and not actually moving the needle on emissions reductions? So again, going down a little bit of a rabbit hole there, but I had to with my new state policy hat on. And I think it goes back to your very point of, when government takes actions, it does impact the individual. It does impact that single farmer, that single producer.
Well, I would certainly say that, on the record, we would advocate for not removing hydropower as one way to make sure that we're meeting our climate objectives. So I'll throw that one out there. But one thing that I am curious about, as you said, it raises prices for the buyer. Does this translate to, hey, we're going to pay more at the grocery store? Does this look like, products are going to be less available for consumers? Or does this also potentially mean that, some of those products like the Yakima Valley, the hops and things and the wheat that's going over to Vietnam, do they start to look elsewhere for sources? Or, it could be a combination of all three. I'm certainly not saying it's a binary thing, but I'm curious what those impacts do look like.
Well, that's exactly right. I think, post-COVID, we've all seen the incredible, tumultuous, ups and downs and struggles for our supply chains on the inflation side of things, and just costs overall. And so, I can't speak to what kind of repercussions we could see potentially on our supply chains due to these increased gas prices, but I think it's certainly only going to continue to contribute to the difficulty for the average Washingtonian to be able to fill up at the pump, amidst a lot of these other, increased prices at the grocery store, et cetera, that we've been seeing post-COVID. So, I can't speak to the macroeconomic level, but I can certainly speak to the fact that, your average Washingtonian that lives here in Eastern Washington, excuse me, is going to really feel that burden when it comes to filling up at the pump this summer. And that's something that we usually see on a cyclical basis each summer. But unfortunately, here in Washington State, we're going to see it even worse because of that state-based system.
So, with regards to energy policy and some of the things that are impacting the folks you're talking about, I know that we're not necessarily out of the woods on this. I mean, this study and these processes, it's not like a one and done type of thing. What else do you see happening regionally and nationally with regards to energy policy that could be of concern for hydropower and those that are depending on the rivers?
Well, yeah, I think, we're only 6 months or 6 weeks out of the legislature wrapping up their job in Olympia. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, rearing its ugly head is the legislature once again funded two multi-million dollar studies on how we can replace the benefits of the system, of the river dam system. And so this is something that we just see time and time again. And I do see some of our local leaders here in Eastern Washington who have spoken up about the fact that, again, why are we wasting taxpayer dollars on these studies that are only going to come up with the same information, the same data that we already have. And so it's a concern for me that, I think let's just go into the black and white dynamic of, breaching the dams or not breaching the dams. And I've always said that obviously this federal system is, Congress would have to make an act in order to actually breach them, which is something that I don't think is ever going to happen. However, it isn't going to be just one day that we wake up and Congress says, all right, let's breach these dams. That's not the actual threat to our system. It's the death by 1,000 cuts that's actually going to harm our river power system. If we make these dams so obsolete that they can't actually produce the clean, affordable, reliable power that they have for so many decades, then yeah, that is what's going to end up being the threat to their ability to continue. And that's what we see with litigation after litigation and mandate after mandate from a judge's bench in how the operations are conducted at these dams, rather than letting the actual engineers and scientists who know how best to operate this system for both the benefit of the communities on an energy level, but also for the benefit of our natural resources and our fish species. If a judge is dictating how the system is run rather than those experts, then yeah, they are going to become obsolete. They are going to die a death by 1,000 cuts if we continue to limit their ability to produce efficient energy. So that's always, I think, been my concern, my perspective here. And so it's not going to be an easy, just black and white. All right, we saved the day. Congress didn't vote to breach the dams. Rather, it's a lot of these other bureaucratic processes that are taking place that don't catch the headlines, that don't catch attention from folks, that are the real issue, and are something that demonstrates why, Northwest River Partners and Washington Policy Center and so many other advocates for the system have to continue to do our jobs, because we're never going to just be done, right? We're never going to have a mission accomplished day, because these issues are too serious and too complicated to be able to have such a binary approach. It's going to be the work for decades to come, in how critical it is to make sure that we keep the lights on in our region and the power on for our communities.
So one thing I want to ask you too there, I mean, we have definitely worked really hard too on looking at the upcoming studies that were funded there, and we did a lot of tremendous work, I think, as a region to make sure that these are going to be a step in the right direction in terms of how they're conducted and what they're going to look like. But do you still see maybe some concern there for some of the folks that you talked about in the ones that are struggling kind of post Murray-Inslee, is there still some concern there that they're going to run into issues with these studies?
Again, I'll just go back to my overall premise that anytime government takes action, there will be an impact on folks, and we need to recognize that. And that's why it's important to know that we can't just willy-nilly throw these ideas out there, that there are repercussions. So yes, absolutely. I mean, every day that an agricultural whether it's an organization or an actual farmer is not actually spent focusing on their jobs, on whether it's the actual growing and producing or expanding markets, every day that they're not focused on being able to do their job is going to hurt them. No doubt about it. And especially when we force them to keep just doing the same thing over and over again, it's a head scratcher, and it can also lend to the idea of people become numb to it. It's like, all right, well, it's just another study. I guess we'll just dig up the same information, and that's not what we can do, because we have to make sure that the facts continue to be on our side. And so the numbers can't just be kind of pulled out of thin air. They have to actually be the facts and data on the ground to make sure that we're getting it right. I'll never discount the repercussions, the impact that such actions have on these sectors and on these communities.
Well, and to your credit, what you're saying also aligns with something that I discussed with one of our previous guests here on DAM, Blaine Meek from Agri Northwest, and we talked a lot about just the fact that, yeah, we're talking about crops, right? We're talking about agriculture, things that are constantly living and in fluctuation, and they don't just sit idly by while people are focused on other things, or while issues are coming up. You can't really steer them in any one direction. They're gonna do what they're gonna do. So yeah, what you're saying, it makes perfect sense in terms of, yeah, if they're not, if people aren't out there working and tending to that, things can get out of hand pretty fast.
Absolutely. Yep. Nope. I would completely agree.
So you also brought up, some of the challenges there with litigation, and what are you seeing when it comes to the courtrooms and how that could impact the hydro system?
Yeah, unfortunately, like we've seen, just far too much is just a politicization. And I think it kind of goes back to the start of our conversation about the idea of let's have a real dialogue. Let's actually, sit down and work through this together. And instead, when certain interests and industries are kept in the dark, and there's a direct political, motive that's being utilized to say, all right, we're just going to include strategic decision making with certain perspectives and with certain industries and not others, that's never going to lend to a comprehensive, beneficial solution for the region. And so often government is about coming together and not everyone being completely happy, but they should all be a part of the process. And when that happens, when everybody has to give a little, but also to get a little, that's usually at the end of the day when you're making good policy. And so everything that I'm seeing about the ongoing dynamics in these, this litigation and these negotiations is that far too many industries are being left in the dark. They're not actually having real seats at the table. They're not being invited to have seats at the table. And to me, that just is going to end up to more divisiveness and not a true comprehensive benefit for how to move forward for the region. And it's really disappointing.
Well, it's kind of funny to think about it. At the beginning of this discussion, we talked about bipartisanship versus partisanship and divides between East and West. And, essentially what that boiled down to is that the things that get done tend to be bipartisan and, uniform and everyone working towards the same thing. And the things that are unsuccessful tend to be the ones that are divided. And in some ways, it's like the perfect example that we're looking at right here, which is that when not everyone is included on the solutions surrounding the river system and managing hydro and everything like that, we end up in decades of battle over it.
And that's where, I'll just go back to, I think the real means of finding an opportunity for common ground is to, again, look at the actions that so many of our leaders do take together unanimously when it comes to funding, the ongoing work on our river system, the ongoing support for, refurb of our dams, of supporting fisheries and habitat solutions, all these things. It's all of them support these things together, and I think if they focused on that, perhaps we could actually see some progress. Over the last several years, a big component of these discussions have been the role of Congressman Simpson from Idaho and his proposal to tear down the dams and to write a check for the industries that are harmed and kind of call it a day from what I would say. And I'd encourage your listeners to go back and actually, Congressman Newhouse gave a speech for the Andrus Center gathering, which is this yearly environmental conference in Idaho, where a year or two prior, Congressman Simpson had officially announced his support for breaching the dams. And Mr. Newhouse focused on a myriad of components in these discussions in his speech on this issue. But one key point is that so often, proponents of dam breaching will often say of those who don't support dam breaching that all you want is the status quo. All you want is to keep, you're not bringing any solutions forward. And that's where, I very much take pause there, because that's actually not true. And I go back to that very point: is every year on a bipartisan basis, Democrats and Republicans come together to support putting in new turbines at the dams, providing more resources for fish habitat and fisheries, and all of the benefits for beneficial programs that are supporting our fish. All of them together are supporting continued progress. This idea that any of us want just the status quo and don't want to see increased runs for our fish and increased efficiencies for our clean hydro system, that's just not true. And so I think that's such a lazy argument to be made, is, oh, well, all you want is the status quo. You're not providing solutions. We have all kinds of federal solutions that have been proposed, and every year our leaders fund those solutions to make sure that we continue to see progress. And I think that's a key component of the story that we need to make sure that we're telling, is all of us are continuing to support progress being made.
No, we certainly are. And, you bring up a lot of great points there. I mean, there have been numerous improvements. And, again, something I say probably too often at this point on the podcast is that, the dams themselves might appear the same, but as far as what's being done internally to improve them and make them better for, generating energy, better for fish passage, better for all sorts of things, those improvements are constantly being made. And as you mentioned, it's something that is being done, with support and funding from all sorts of different groups. So no, it's a really fantastic point.
And again, I go back to that point about leadership. And again, it's this: we've got world-class research that's being conducted here that. And you can use that term world-class very flippantly if you'd like, except for the fact that it's true that the research that's being conducted here, the efficiencies that have been made on the turbines on our dams here, are now being used by industry and governments in other parts of the world. And so again, that key piece of telling our story, we are leaders here in the Columbia Basin when it comes to energy and resource management and developing further efficiencies there. And so often this dynamic of this debate is focused on, you're harming the environment, you're not supporting native fish species, et cetera. And yet, actually, we are developing world-class solutions in order to demonstrate that these things can coexist together. We can continue to benefit our fish species so that we have bigger and bigger runs moving forward. And so it's something that we should actually be proud of and not at all ashamed of.
I couldn't agree with you more. Speaking of leadership and solutions and trying to find ways to make some progress on these issues, we've got this Natural Resources Committee field hearing coming up. What opportunities are you seeing there in terms of what we can do to move forward on some of these hydro issues?
Yeah, I'm really excited that the Resources Committee is going to be coming back out to the Northwest to talk about these things. I helped initiate a field hearing here in Tri-Cities. I think it was 5 years ago now, back in 2018. And similar to all of those field tours and those various opportunities that we discussed earlier in the conversation with the Western Caucus, I think the same goes here. Is when we can highlight the expertise of the actual local leaders, the folks who are directly impacted and who help directly manage the system and the industries that rely upon it, then all of us are going to benefit, and our leaders in Washington, D.C. from across the country are going to benefit to hear from them. And so I'm really excited. I know we've got some local energy officials who will be speaking, some policy folks, some representing the agricultural community, the river system. And so, again, having the opportunity to tell our story, to be proud of the leadership that we espouse here in the Columbia Basin, and to share it with an audience of members of Congress from across the country, I think it's going to be a tremendous opportunity for us to do all of those things.
And on the note of opportunities, are there opportunities that our audience here today could make a difference?
Well, listen, when we have an audience of members of Congress coming here, that goes, let's tap into it, right? So write a letter to the editor and the paper recognizing that we're going to have these folks coming here in a couple of weeks. Submit an op-ed to your local paper. I'm very much a traditionalist when it comes to the power of the written word and of your local paper, but also obviously utilizing even we talked about some of the detriments of social media earlier, but there can be the positives. And so, share your perspective out there. You take this opportunity, this moment where, hey, with the frame of mind that our local community is about to be visited by members of Congress, leaders at the federal level, share your thoughts there and provide that opportunity to be an impetus for your friends and your networks to be hearing that message, even though it may be old news to them or to some of them. I'm willing to bet that most of us have people in our lives, in our networks, that can always be learning more, hearing more about the benefits of our system. And I live in Tri-Cities here. Many of our communities in the region just simply would not be here without our river power system and all of the benefits they provide to us. And it's incredible to see the growth taking place in regions like Tri-Cities. And so much of that is due to our incredible water resources, our incredibly affordable, reliable, efficient, clean power that we have here as well. So many benefits for us to constantly be grateful for, and so take that opportunity to tell your story, to share your gratitude for how lucky we are to live in such a beautiful and beautifully gifted region.
Now, let me ask you this: having worked in congressional, having worked for like Congressman Newhouse, for example, and filling these different congressional roles, when people write in like that, when people take the time to do that and share their perspectives and stories and things like that, how impactful actually is that? Because so often what we hear here, I've heard it, I've gotten emails about it, I've heard it from people at different events, community events that we go out to and host booths at, that, oh, that's a waste of time. They don't listen to me anyways, things like that. But having you here today, maybe you could explain, what value those things do hold, and maybe make a case for why people should or shouldn't pursue different avenues of getting involved.
No, I appreciate that question a lot. And I can't understate how important it is, because so often members of Congress will receive these uh, they're little they're not surveys, what's the right word, essentially there's little online campaigns where you get an email and it says write your name here and we'll automatically send a form letter to our member of Congress. And so they'll get 200 of the same letter over and over, and you obviously read those, but when you actually get an organic note from a constituent in the district that is heartfelt, or lending their perspective, or they're telling their story, it's absolutely valuable, and it is very much seen and heard by not only the staff but then also the member as well. And so what, like you said, whether it's writing your member of Congress or a letter to the editor in the local paper or posting on social media or what have you, I think we should never take for granted the opportunity to share your perspective, tell your story, because it does make a difference. And it's incredibly valuable when a member of Congress can then point to it specifically and say, I just heard from a constituent the other day, and sharing that organic life story, that little tidbit, it helps them do their jobs. Absolutely. They inherently they're there to represent their constituents, right? And so actually hearing from constituents is always helpful.
Well, I appreciate that a lot, and hopefully also people will share this podcast as well, and that can be one great way to get the word out, and also one great way to convince other people that they should actually take the time to do those things, and really I appreciate you taking the time to explain the value to our listeners of that stuff. Always trying to find ways to do it, and I have absolutely no shame about it either. But I feel like I blinked and we burned through almost an hour and a half here. And I appreciate you taking the time to do this today. I think, as you mentioned, we could probably have an entire book on any number of the subjects that were discussed during today's podcast. But while I've got you kind of on a more advice focused note, we do this thing on every episode where we try to make a good connection with our audience between the guests that we have on and themselves, and we're all about kind of telling not only the untold stories and trying to get as many of these really interesting perspectives out there, but we also want people to have the story of the guest that we're having on, right? And really make that human connection. So the thing that I ask all of our guests to do here at the end, and I kind of spring on them last minute so that we get the most honest and really genuine take as possible, is to ask you for just some general life advice. It doesn't have to be anything related to what we talked about today, but something that comes to mind that is really valuable to you, that you'd like to share with our audience here.
Well, I appreciate that, Austin. And what I'll say is I'm someone who really values a sense of place. And so as someone who I grew up, like I said, here in the Pacific Northwest, but I grew up very much a suburban kind of city boy. I was not around agriculture, or had never shot a gun before I went to work for the congressman and visited his farm. And I got to tell you, the incredible work ethic that I really learned from interacting and working directly with rural communities. I think of things like the FFA or 4-H organizations and the work ethic that they really instill in their students. And it's made me fall in love with rural communities and rural values. And never imagined that I would, I originally grew up in the shadows of San Francisco and then Portland, lived in Seattle. I never thought that I would, proactively decide I'm going to go move to Tri-Cities, Washington, surrounded by vineyards and the Columbia River and ag land as far as you can see. But I really fell in love with the people and the work ethic that is espoused by rural communities. And so I'm just delighted to have this be the home by choice. I'm not an original Tri-Citian, but I've fallen in love with the people in the community. And as a big wino as well, I do not at all mind being surrounded by wineries and vineyards out here. So I would say a recognition of that sense of place is something that I have really found to be important in my life. And I think it's also about making the best of wherever you are and finding the value of wherever you are. And I think that's where, over the last 8 years working for Congressman Newhouse and traveling to the communities in central and eastern Washington, that I recognize, wow, there is so much to gain here, and there's so much value in the people and the communities here, that so much so that I think I want to live there. I want to move and be a part of that community there. So that sense of place is something that I genuinely value in my life.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think it's something in these days a lot of people find themselves searching for as well. And so, hopefully in the way that you've been able to find it there in the Tri-Cities, a lot of our listeners are able to find the same thing if they don't have it already. So I appreciate you sharing that advice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, it's been great to be with you today. And like you said, it did fly by, but I so appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with your audience. And again, I'm just so grateful to all of the work that Northwest River Partners has done over the years. You guys were such a key partner for me as a congressional staffer, and continue to be now that I'm back home working on the state policy level with Washington Policy Center. So again, we're just really grateful for the time, Austin.
Oh, likewise. We're really grateful for your time as well. And, been happy to work with you on a lot of different things, and also definitely thankful for the Washington Policy Center and some of the stuff you guys put out. And particularly getting together some of the data, the information, things like that. I'll see some of that stuff pop up, and it's like, oh, that's helpful, because we're obviously trying to work sometimes in the same direction on a lot of issues. So really appreciate it. Thanks for making the time, and we'll, I'm sure, be in touch and talking a lot more.
Sounds great. Thanks, Austin.
That'll do it for this episode of Damn. Not only did today's episode provide great insight, as they always do, but it also left me with a lot of things to think about, particularly those points on working together and recognizing the impacts of actions that are so easy to neglect or overlook altogether. It's clear that Sean is passionate about these issues, and after sharing his perspective, it's really not hard to see why. Now, as he mentioned, there's some tremendous value and opportunity for you hydro lovers out there to get the word out to our policymakers. While we're all about educating them, we do it on your behalf. They're really interested in hearing from you. You can take a page out of our friend Ted Case's book, and no, not literally, of course, unless you plan on purchasing another copy, by taking 10 minutes or so to express your story through the written word. You might just find that it's something worth sharing in the name of better energy policy. Alright, remember how I mentioned that Who We Are page in the intro? Well, you're in luck, because we have a shiny, brand new nwriverpartners.org to go check out. While you're there, you can utilize our contact form to fill us in on potential guests and topics you'd like us to cover here on DAM. We are always open to any and all suggestions that help us continue to provide the best Northwest hydropower podcast possible. Then, there's the other usual housekeeping. Firstly, there's the reviews. We encourage you to give us feedback on your favorite listening platform. Positive reviews contribute to audience growth, and audience growth means more episodes of Damn for you every other Friday. Of course, you wouldn't have to keep track of that schedule if you subscribe and turn on notifications while you're in the app you're listening through right now. Personally, I'm a Spotify guy, and I have been for a long, long time. I just checked a few days ago and discovered that we still had no ratings of any kind on the podcast page. So for my fellow Spotify people, let's get on it. I'll give our friends who listen on another platform the pass for now, but don't let me catch you ignoring this important part of supporting Damn. I've even given you permission to leave negative ratings and reviews, so there's really no excuse not to do it. Last but certainly not least, you can visit us at NW River Partners on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And I always encourage everyone to go see what we're up to there. All right, I hope you enjoyed this one, and hey, we've got a lot of great episodes coming up soon as well, so make sure to stay tuned for that. Until next time, see ya!